That's right, people. Nintendo hasn't made any games since the Gamecube.
What are you talking about?
Alright, the title is clearly an exaggeration, but in part it holds some truth. As many of you may know, the N64 is my favourite console ever for many reasons, but one of the big reasons is something I always try to convey when bringing up the N64, and that is that Nintendo EAD magic. Nintendo EAD. You'll never stop hearing me singing their praise for good reasons. When Nintendo EAD are on fire, they create a magic in video games that no one else can touch. Perhaps with only Sega, for me, coming in close in terms of feels. But Nintendo EAD also follow up with the gameplay and game design far more than Sega have ever done for the most part. Nintendo EAD. Glorious, people. But Nintendo EAD, or Nintendo EBD as they are known today, have in many ways left many Nintendo IPs behind, or to be more accurate, no longer fully develop these IPs by themselves. You see, many people call for Nintendo to bring back many of their old IPs, some of which have been gone on home consoles for decades, and as always, considering these titles and the impact that they had not just on us Nintendo fans, but also the industry as a whole, we're all always left scratching our heads while screaming to the rafters, come on big N, give us, what we want. But let's quickly talk about Nintendo's IPs that Nintendo, for the most part, haven't fully developed internally themselves. Many of these IPs were all yearning for to return, or even some that have returned, but once again, have not been fully developed by Nintendo themselves, often calling on development partners to assist them. And this list might surprise you, not just in the names, but also the last time Nintendo fully developed a game in these series themselves. And just for clarity, I'll mostly be focusing on home consoles here, but we'll still sprinkle in the odd handheld game or two. So let's start. So that's right, the last time Nintendo themselves made an F-Zero game was on the N64, back in the best gaming year ever, that is 1998. 22 years and counting, people. F-Zero GX on the Gamecube was mostly a Sega game, with even Nintendo being blown away by what Sega achieved with the series on the Gamecube hardware. Could Nintendo themselves, without any help, make a better F-Zero game than GX? You know what? When I play Mario Kart 8 and jump on the Mute City and Big Blue tracks, listen to that music and see that art style, which is more reminiscent of the SNES F-Zero, another Nintendo EAD game by the way, I found myself saying, this is actually more F-Zero looking and sounding and feeling than the art direction and sound direction of F-Zero GX. But of course, that's not to take anything away from the crom tier cromness that is F-Zero GX. Nintendo themselves could make an F-Zero without any assistance. I truly believe this. So, what's stopping them? Then we have Wave Race 64. Bluestone was developed by Nintendo NST, a division Nintendo set up in the US to appeal more to Western gamers, and you can feel that in Bluestone, which I personally feel is an utterly fantastic racer. I loved it, which is, it's only negative being somewhat twitchy controls at times. But here I go again, taking you back to that EAD magic. If you're a Wave Race fan like me, you will know exactly what I mean about the feels between both games. Wave Race 64 and EAD make you feel like the waves want you to have fun, whilst also feeling somewhat blissful. That could also do with Kazumi Totaka's beautiful soundtrack, which if you aren't familiar with, then think of Wii Sports soundtrack for reference. The Nintendo EAD magic was gone from Bluestone, and I missed that, and would miss it again if a new Wave Race appeared and EAD weren't fully at the helm. 1080 snowboarding on N64 felt so different to every other snowboarding game out during that time. EAD really wanted you to feel like you were on the snow, that you were on that board and you had to have both in mind for every single moment of the race. Something that was, pretty much gone in 1080 Avalanche, although Avalanche overall I'd argue was a better game, purely based off the tracks, music, and cool extras, but the game certainly felt different, very similar to how Wave Race Bluestorm felt, which makes sense as 1080 Avalanche was another Nintendo NST developed game. Then we have Metroid, with the last fully developed Nintendo Metroid also being the last fully brand new 2D Metroid, that being Metroid Fusion back in 2002. I mean, think about that, people. We haven't had a fully brand new 2D Metroid with a new story and scenario for 18 years. Hell, you could argue that we've never had a 3D Metroid from Nintendo themselves. But as with many other Nintendo IPs, Nintendo are many times as knee-deep in a development as their chosen partners are, if not more sometimes. So when I mentioned Metroid Prime, even though that's Retro Studios and they done a lot of the work, trust me, Nintendo were there. Then we have Star Fox with Star Fox 64, or Lilac Wars as I call it, being the last Star Fox game purely from Nintendo, with every other following game being passed to or co-developed with other developers. Star Fox is another series close to my Nintendo heart, and there are reasons why people say it hasn't reached the heights of Lilac Wars, one of them being, with me saying once again, that Nintendo EAD magic, people. 1997 for this one, people. 1997, since Nintendo fully made a Star Fox game all by themselves. Then the N64 just keeps on giving with that Nintendo EAD magic, and that also comes in the form of Pilot Wings 64. Hell, I'd argue that's where Pilot Wings was last seen, as Pilot Wings Resort, not made internally by Nintendo, felt like a soulless tech demo, nowhere near on the same level as the SNES and N64 versions. Many of us have seen the footage of what Factor 5 were going to do with Pilot Wings on the Wii, but even the glorious Factor 5, I know Nintendo EAD when it comes to capturing that unique magic I personally crave. Another shocker for you people, the last Donkey Kong game made directly by Nintendo was Donkey Kong Jungle Beat on the Gamecube, and some would argue that this isn't a true Donkey Kong game, although I personally slapped him for that, as I love this game. But hell, you could argue that Nintendo themselves in full have never made what many now consider a Donkey Kong game, as in the Donkey Kong Country series. And do you want a new Wario Land game directly developed by Nintendo? Well, the last one was on the Game Boy Advance. Other games like Wario World and Shake Dimension were made by different developers. Internal Nintendo jumped Wario to the WarioWare series, which, don't get me wrong, WarioWare on the Game Boy Advance is, in my opinion, one of the best games Nintendo has actually ever made. But I was also around when Wario first came on the scene in Super Mario Land 2, the 6 golden coins. I even remember the advert. And he then got his own side-scrolling series, which was fantastic, all developed by Nintendo, but not anymore. Then to quickly highlight a few more, Super Punch-Out on the SNES was the last time Nintendo fully took the helm on the series. Luigi's Mansion changed developers after the first game was released on the Gamecube. Yoshi as a series on consoles, and Nintendo once again hasn't completely developed themselves since they've done Yoshi's Story on the N64, which some people don't like, but I personally have a fun past with that game and found it enjoyable. And finally, you have Excitebike, which Nintendo last fully developed on the NES. The NES, with Excitebike 64 and the rest of the Excite series being developed by other developers. It's slightly crazy when you think about it, right? Especially considering the series I mentioned. You got F-Zero, Wave Race, 1080 Snowboarding, Metroid, Star Fox, Pilot Wings, Donkey Kong, Wario Land, Punch-Out, Luigi's Mansion, Yoshi, Excitebike, and so on. Now, don't get me wrong. We've luckily had further entries in these series since Nintendo was last fully in the development role of them, and many, I'd argue, are some of the best games to come out of the house of Nintendo. And I'm sure many could argue that some of those games were beyond what Nintendo themselves could have done, which would certainly be an interesting debate, right? But man, I'm telling you people, unless you were there at the time, or have all these games, or have played all these games as much as I have, there is no denying that when the Big N took the wheel and said we'll do it fully ourselves, there was a magic that has yet to be captured again in many of these IPs. I of course want all of these IPs to have new entries, and it's gotten to the point where even I'm saying give it to another developer if you don't want to do it yourselves, Nintendo. Or, I've seen some developers show such a talent that I'm like, yeah, collaborate with these guys and I'm sure they'd nail it. As an example, get Team Cherry to make a 2D Metroid game. I think that would just be a marriage made in heaven. But anyway, I'm done here. I just wanted to remind people of what series Nintendo haven't fully developed themselves for a crazy amount of years. And a part of me wonders, why? Are they still capable with some of these series, or has that Nintendo EAD I once knew and loved, resided to making only Mario and Zelda games for the most part today? Which isn't completely true, of course, as we get some other glorious games like Pikmin, Splatoon, ARMS, etc. But let's also be honest here, people. It feels mostly like Mario and Zelda from Nintendo EAD, but at least we still end up with games like The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild and Super Mario Odyssey, which still show the industry exactly what can be done, and when gaming is at the top. But anyway, this video has gone on for long enough. Drop me some comments below and let me know your thoughts on Nintendo and fully developing or not developing many of their best named IPs, and why you think Nintendo hasn't decided to fully tackle these IPs themselves. But yeah, thanks for listening, take care all, and peace.